Come on up to the stage if you want to. The stream should be live now. How's it going? I'm doing great. How about yourself? That's good to hear. Um, Basically, today wanted to go deeper into breaking down genocide. How you doing? Inspired. Feel free to come up and co-host. Um, Basically, after looking at the U.S. and United Nations definitions of genocide, taking that knowledge and started to look at all of the data for our genocide, Freedmen Genocide, and then noticing certain patterns, and then from there, kind of developed a framework to like try to define it mathematically, so you could actually have a way to prove it without anyone being able to say you're lying. Um, and so today, yeah, I want to break down that solution and share with everybody. How you doing, Inspired?
Hi, sorry, we're already clicking on the YouTube trying to. I'm doing great. Hey.
Awesome.
I don't want to pronounce anybody's name wrong because I was pronouncing the son's name wrong. But,
It's okay. I pronounce it Amir. Is that correct?
yes, and it's Eric. And what is your name? Mine is Felicia. Okay. Hey, Felicia. How you doing? Hello.
Okay, we doing real names. Okay, I'm gonna call you Felicia on the thing.
No, we ain't doing real names. I be doing too much work in the industry. It's for the family.
Oh, man. Yeah, yeah. I can pull up the stream. How you doing? Carry it on code. But yeah, I got the stream up.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm gonna be popping in and out of your space,
Okay.
Freeman Party.
Okay.
I do like that I can stream it on the computer,
Right.
on YouTube. So yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, no worries. And for this episode, it'll probably be like a little bit shorter, maybe like at least an hour for sure. I'm gonna try to spend like 30 minutes breaking this down, and then like going through the notes, and then the rest we'll just try to do Q&A, convo, all that good stuff.
I'm gonna go ahead and drop down. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so also feel free to share out the space so people can find it. Um, but yeah, if y'all ready, let's get started. Um, so check it out. Genocide. So we already know what the United Nations definition is for genocide, and the United States definition of genocide is based on the United Nations one. So they're basically one and the same. So one of the things I realized, because even before I got into looking at genocide from a freedman perspective, I had already come across Sean Rochester in The Black Tax, and he talks about us being held to 2% of basically the benefits of the country, and he gives a bunch of examples of that in employment and um, you know funding and access to capital and things like that. Um, so basically what I did is I broke down the definition of genocide that the United Nations and the United States uses into benefits and costs. So the benefits one is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So that's the one way they control the benefits, and that's through apartheid. Um, on our site, we talk about apartheid in housing and schools and things like that. Um, you also have costs, um, and that includes four of the five definitions of genocide. So killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So this is how they control the cost, and this is how they control the benefits. Um, and basically, for us, and even for the definition of genocide, only one of these needs to apply. Either they need to try to hold the benefits to a certain level, or they need to harm you with one of these costs. And we actually unfortunately qualify for every definition of genocide, all five definitions of genocide. They control the benefits and they control our costs. So when you start breaking it down by the numbers, a pattern I noticed has to do with the percent of the population and uh, the level at which they control the benefits and the level at which they raise the costs. So in in short, you can say genocide is when benefits are less than the percent of the population, or when costs are greater than or equal to the percent of the population. So when we get into, I tried to make this diagram to um, kind of give a overview. Basically, um, you have the percent of the population in the middle. You have a scale from 0 to 100%. Um, And what happens is the benefits are pushed to anything to basically kill the population. So for us, the African American population in the United States is 13.4% of the entire US population, right? Now, based on us delineating, 80% of the black population is freedmen, 20% of the black population is African immigrants. So 80% of 13.4% is 10.8%. So we represent 10.8% of the US population as freedmen, while African immigrants only represent 2.6% of the overall US population, right? And so if you then imagine, okay, the genocide threshold being our population at 10.8%, basically we can round up to 11% essentially, and say 11% is the threshold. And whether consciously or unconsciously, they are making sure that any benefits we receive are generally less than 11% of the population, and then any of the costs are greater than 11%, greater than or equal to 11%. And so that's a pattern you'll notice throughout when you look at all of the data. And so just think about this. If we're 11% of the US population and they give us 2% of the water, right, then you're going to have 11% fighting over 2% of the water to stay alive, right? So they deliberately create these conditions where there's going to be conflict because there's not enough of any of the actual resources that are needed to sustain life. Um, and then on the cost side, um, they're going to impose costs to basically try to destroy our population. Um, so that's killing us, that's throwing us in prison and jail, that's doing things like imposing measures to prevent births, like forced hysterectomies, forced sterilization, um, and then things like family separation. Um, we are 77% more likely to have our kids taken away, even if we're not at a greater risk of harming them compared to other races. Um, so when you look at the data from a Freedman perspective, and I'll try to zoom in on this. Um, if you look at it from a Freedman perspective, basically our benefits are held to that 2% black tax. So maternal pensions at 3%, black businesses at 2.5%, black wealth at 2%, uh, venture capital at 1%, births at 1%, banks, black banks only own 2%. Um, and we could go on, and there's many examples, right? So the imposed genocide on us in terms of imposing genocide on our benefits is at the 2% level. On I didn't get a chance to update this yet, but this should be now 10 point. basically 11% to be more accurate. But basically, if you look at all the costs that we absorb, even though we represent around 10%, 11% of the population, we represent 25% of people in foster care. We represent 50% of the hate crimes, around 50% of the exonerations from uh, charges and crimes. Um, and I broke down into a table kind of more specifically what the different costs and benefits are. So, approximately 2% of the benefits, 1% of VCs, 1% of limited partners. Those are the people that invest in VCs, and then CEOs um, in terms of representation. Now, on the cost side, like I said, 77% more likely to have our kids taken away by Child Protective Services, 54% more likely to be a victim of a hate crime, 50% likely to be exonerated for a crime, 35% hysterectomy rate, 30% maternal mortality rate, 27% abortion rate, 23% foster care rate, 13% infant mortality rate. So basically, all of these are greater than the percent of our population that we represent, and there's a ton more on our website, on our genocide prevention page that we can go through. But the point is, once you start breaking it down like this and recognize the patterns, um, you can create a mathematical proof and then use that mathematical proof to create a program that can give you the right answer back if you give it data. So on the math side, you define three things. The population is X, the benefits are B, and the cost are C. And genocide is when um, B is less than X and C is greater than or equal to X, right? And so it's actually super simple in terms of math, right? Like this is like, you know, not like calculus or anything like that, right? So building a function based on that is pretty simple as well. So basically, you could build a program that returns, is this genocide or not? And you need to put in B, X, and C, and these are in terms of percent. And then you just turn this mathematical equation into a function where you say if B is less than X, or this symbol means or, excuse me, X is less than or equal than C, return true, meaning it is genocide. Else return false, meaning it's not genocide. So for us, like I said, you could run this, throw in all the data, and it'll spit out true every time. Now, if you ran this same function for the white population, for example, let's just take, we can go back up and look at one of these like VC funding. White people are 67% of the country, but they make up 99% of the venture capital funding. So if you threw that into those numbers into here, it would spit back false and say, no, that's not genocide, right? So um, all the examples you could do for white people is basically not genocide, right? Like they represent a smaller part of the population, like maternal pensions. They're 67% of the population, but they get 98% of the maternal pensions, right? So again, not genocide. So any data that you could collect for any race, you could run the numbers on essentially and basically say, is it genocide or not? So now we have like a mathematical proof as well as a program that can run the math and give you back true or false um, in terms of, you know, letting you know, is it really genocide or not based on this mathematical proof, right? So the good thing about this is if you need to have an argument in court or an argument in any type of um, you know debate or anything like that, you can literally use the math to prove um, that not only freedmen are experiencing genocide in the United States, but also that no other um, race in this country is experiencing genocide in this country, especially at the levels that we are. Um, so that's kind of like the short and sweet of it. That's actually probably shorter. Like that was only about 15 minutes. Um, I could go through, the website on the genocide page and show you more statistics, but if anybody wants to jump in now, you feel free to. Um, Let me switch screens for a second. How you doing, CJ? How you doing? Last one left. Um, the angry Akata, Debo.
Hey.
What up? What are your thoughts so far? Anything I need to explain deeper? Did it make sense?
Yeah, I'm not a math person, so it takes me a minute to do the statistics.
No worries.
I'll go back over it. I mean, it seemed pretty simple, but my math skills is kind of like lacking.
No, don't trip. Like the simplest way to think of this, you could even break this into two things. This is really just shorthand, right? So this could be, you know, two equations. So I'll just simplify it. You could have it like this, and it needs to be, you can just add or in between, and then this could be just the final version. Point is, like if I give you two numbers, right? X being the percent of the population you're looking at. So in our case, we're 11% of the U.S. population. And then B is the benefits. So, for example, how much venture capital funding do freedmen get every year? The answer to that would be 1%. So then you would plug in 1% and be like, is 1% less than 11%? And if that's true, then it's genocide, right? On the on this side, the cost side, you say, okay, X is still 11% the population of the United States freedmen represent. Now let's figure out a cost. One cost would be the exoneration rate. We represent basically 50% of the exonerations in this country. So is 11 less than or equal to 50%? Yes, that's genocide. So the way to think about it is, find which data point you want to analyze, whether it be the hate crime rate. We represent 54% of the hate crimes. So is 11 less than or equal to 54%? Yes, so that's genocide. Basically, you can plug in any data point, focus it on our freedmen population, or you could use this to analyze like white people, Mexicans, whatever, and then you can prove that they're not experiencing genocide. So um, that's kind of the use of this. It gives us like a objective way to analyze genocide without um, imposing any bias. All we need is the data and then to run the numbers. Anybody else want to add anything?
I just wanted to, can you elaborate on the intent or the intentional 2%? Just so
Yeah.
that I'm clear on that.
Yeah, the 2% essentially represents the black tax. So if we go back up here, if we look at the general example, all the benefits have to be less than the percent of the population that the group represents, right? So again, we're basically 10.8%, which we could just round up to 11, just to simplify numbers. So we represent like 11% of the U.S. population, and all of our benefits are usually held at 2%. And here are some examples. Maternal pensions are held at 3%. So all freedmen women get 3% of the pensions. White women get 98%, 96%. Um, on the black businesses side, we represent only 2.5% of black businesses. On the wealth side, we only hold 2% of the wealth in the country. Um, On the birth side, our annual birth rate is 1.5%. On the venture capital side, we only get 1% of all venture capital funding into startups. Um, all limited partners, who are the people that invest into venture capital firms, there's only 1% of limited partners that are black. Um, and then if you look at CEOs, only 1% of CEOs are black. Um, and banks only hold 2%. Black banks only hold 2% of the money in this country. So basically, at every level, like if we were doing white numbers, we would say 67%, but then they get 98% of the benefits in terms of capital. See what I'm saying? So we're held purposely to this 2% black tax that first Sean Rochester pointed out. Um, so that's what I mean by the 2%. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Is there a way for us to do those numbers like per state as well, like in the future, like if we were to break those numbers down?
Yeah, you can break it down by state, and what you'll generally see is you may have some states with slightly more, like one state, like in California, like the venture capital rate for blacks will be slightly higher than the rest of the country. The rest of the country will be even lower than 1%. You know what I mean? Like that's how segregated it is. So, I mean, yeah, you can break this down like by district, by state, by city, etc.
So,
But it'll still average out to 2% and float around that 2% level.
so technically, what we're saying is, as a Freedmen advocate, is we're saying that the federal government, this is what is being imposed on us, and they're not intervening in reference to that. Federally, we're being held at under 2% or 2% or less of whatever's going on to benefit our community, right?
Exactly. And I would even say it even more like this, whether, like I said, consciously or unconsciously. And I use the example of venture capital. There's only about 1,000 venture capitalists, and they don't all have to get together in a meeting and decide to be racist, right? All they have to do is each be racist, and you still get the same result. You don't have to have some grand conspiracy um, that they all have to be colluding. If they're all on average racist, you still get the same output. And year over year, if it's 1%, clearly y'all racist. So and if it's 2% for virtually all of these things, even births, which surprised me because like at first I looked at 4 million in 1865, 42 million now, and I was like, okay, that's a 10x growth. That sounds pretty good. But if you look at the growth rate is 1.5%, which is the black tax, which is basically still trying to hold our population to a certain level. And again, it's not like they are all telling us what to do with our sex lives, but we're getting the same results through this system of extermination. The hysterectomy rate, the abortion rate, the maternal mortality rate, the infant mortality rate. It creates the outcomes, regardless of what we're planning.
Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted you. So you're saying that this equates to a black genocide?
Yes.
And so what's the end goal? Okay, so you want to get it equated to be a black genocide. You want to go to the UN with it?
Well, the UN and the United States has rules for genocide. I'll pull up the U.S. one.
Yeah, that's my issue, because when it comes to black people's issues, I would say it's more of a cultural genocide than a physical genocide.
No, it's both. The cultural one is like ethnocide. The cultural one, that's the definition of ethnocide. It's cultural genocide, essentially. Like when it's focused primarily on the erasure of culture. It's one thing to have your culture erased. It's another thing to have your births being held to a certain growth rate and all of the wealth of the country being held to a certain rate, and then all of the killings and all of the locking ups and the deaths in the hospitals are greater than a percent of the population. That's more than an ethnocide. because they're not just erasing our culture; they're actually killing us and trying to remove us from existence. Here's the definition of genocide, and it's again the same one that the U.S. had to implement. That there's 196 countries in the United Nations. The United States is one of them. So once they had the Convention on Genocide, they had to implement the law in their own countries. So let me just switch screens really quickly.
So I have another question to ask you. I know when you look at the definition for a genocide by the UN, it says that acts committed with intent to destroy in a whole or part a national, ethnic, racial, or a religious group. Now, what would be the intent? I'm just asking.
The intent is to erase any type of existence of the population, whether that be through restricting, like I said, the benefits. So I gave the example earlier of if we represent 10%, around 11% of the population, but they give us 2% of the water, what's the natural outcome, right? You're gonna have 10% fighting over 2%. That's not enough, right? If you got 8 people fighting over two things, that is needed to like live, it's like you're gonna have a bunch of people die, and that's purposeful. And then on the cost side, they basically kill us at higher rates. We're exonerated at higher rates. We are the hate crimes are at a higher rate, so whether it be, like I said, law enforcement killings or killings by civilians. Um, Now, I'll put up the screen right now. This is the um, U.S. definition of genocide, and again, it's based on the United Nations one, so it's the same, just like you said. Um, with specific intent to destroy in whole or substantial part. Well, I'll just read the whole thing. Basic offense. Whoever, whether in time of peace or in time of war, and with specific intent to destroy in whole or in substantial part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. One, kills members of that group. Two, causes serious bodily injury to members of that group. Three, causes the permanent impairment of the mental faculties of members of the group through drugs, torture, or similar techniques. Four, subjects the group to conditions of life that are intended to cause the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. Five, imposes measures intended to prevent births within the group. Or six, transfers by force children of the group to another group. So the one thing that I like again about these definitions is that you could then find the data for each of these points. You know what I mean? Um, and then match them to the benefits and the costs. The other thing that the U.S. definition has that the United Nation one doesn't specifically like enforce in the same way um, is punishments for genocide. So here are the punishments for genocides, and then we'll give a few examples of how it can be used. So punishment for basic offense. The punishment for an offense under subsection A is one, in the case of an offense under subsection A1, where death results, then by death or imprisonment for life and a fine of not more than $1 million or both. So, for example, if you kill somebody, you need to have capital punishment, which is a death penalty, or imprisonment for life, and a fine of not more than $1 million or both. Then it says two, basically, if it's not anything that results in death, but it's like still genocide, then a fine of not more than $1 million or imprisonment for not more than 20 years or both in any other case. And then if we look at the other parts of this, one is important is attempt and conspiracy. Any person who attempts or conspires to commit an offense under this section shall be punished in the same manner as a person who completes the offense. That essentially means even if you're not the person who pulled the trigger or anything like that, you can still be charged with the same crime, for example, under subsection A, and this would apply to Emmett Till and Carolyn Bryant, who maybe didn't wasn't there to torture um, and actually commit the rest of the lynching, but she was a part of the attempt and the conspiracy that she deserves the same charges as if she had completed it herself. And so, even though the two white supremacists are no longer alive, she is still alive and needs to be charged under this genocide law. And it wouldn't just be charging her under subsection A1, killing members of the group. We can also charge her for 6 transfers by force children of the group to another group. Kidnapping would be under that. Taking Emmett Till from his uh, Moses' house to um, another family of another group, these white supremacists, uh, terrorists, um, that is charged under that section, right? So we can add up multiple charges of genocide just for the killing of Emmett Till. We could also use this for the Flint, Michigan, what's going on with Lowndes County, Alabama, and their water. Um, there's many ways that we need to start utilizing genocide. Um, every act against us should be an automatic charge of genocide, not just hate crimes. Like hate crimes are like minor acts compared to acts of genocide, and we need to really talk about it like it is, and that's why the definitions and looking at the data helps make it irrefutable. Um, the numbers don't lie, and so you can just look at the numbers and they fit in perfectly on a timeline. All of the benefits, if you just put all the benefits, they all tack around 2%, and all of the costs are greater than our population around 11%. So it's textbook definition.
Well, thank you, man. I really appreciate it. I like your perspective on it and why you felt the way you feel about using the term genocide instead of using a black hate crime bill. But I think the UN, they're already on board with it because there was a report that came out, I think it was a year ago, and it was from the UN High Commission on Human Rights. And in the report, they advocated for giving reparations to people descended from slavery. So they've been on it. I think the powers that be within our government, United States, are kind of like pushing back at that. But the UN, they've been very staunch advocates for reparations and for labeling certain things as genocide. So I just appreciate you answering the question for me, man. I just want to get your perspective on it.
Of course, definitely, and good question. And just to even add a little bit to it, once you start looking at the definitions of genocide and even look at the definition of hate crimes and compare that with definitions of crimes against humanity or ethnocide, they're all different, and that's why we got to be specific. So, for example, initially I was thinking crimes against humanity because that comes that came more to my mind than genocide. It was like crimes against humanity, right? Then when I looked up each definition, it's very specific. So genocide is target.
It's the only issue that I have with that is that when you're labeling something as a genocide, it's tough to get intent because one of those cases you had mentioned was the Flint water crisis.
Well, this is why data is important, right? Because the data proves the intent. When there's specific outcomes, like if I plug in the same thing every time and I get genocide, that's specific intent because every time I shouldn't get genocide if it's random, right? If it's like not specific. So this is why the definition of genocide is important. So genocide, defined by the U.S. and the UN, is targeted at a specific group with these harms attached to them on the benefits and the cost side. Now, if you look at the definition of crimes against humanity is not targeted at a specific group. So how could we argue as freedmen for we're being experiencing crimes against humanity if we're the only ones experiencing it? You know what I mean? Then we kind of look silly because it's not crimes against humanity means it's not targeted at a specific group, and it's similar to kind of how hate crimes are defined. and that's why using the word is important. Hate crime is like similar to crimes against humanity, where it's not necessarily targeted at a specific group, right? It's just a crime against a group, but it's not like all those crimes are specifically targeted towards that group. Whereas in our case, under genocide, it is. Another thing that's important compared to genocide and crimes against humanity, they're not crimes against humanity are not agreed upon by the United Nations as a convention like genocide has been. The only two crimes that the United Nations recognizes is genocide and war crimes. So that's another important kind of distinction. And these are just kind of like things where if you're just going into any type of argument or conversation where you need to be very clear and very specific, you don't want to walk in arguing the wrong thing. And genocide is the one that applies to us not only the most, but in every possible way, unfortunately, right? It's not like we want to qualify for genocide. It's that we do, just despite our best wishes.
Can I catch your question real quick?
Go for it.
Okay, cool. So I know, like, you mentioned the genocide. One of the aspects of the genocide is the forceful relocation of children out of that ethnic group. And one thing that was labeled as a genocide was the Native Americans when they had the native schools. And they would take the tribe and they would send them to these native schools.
Yep.
And a lot of kids died there.
Yep.
Now, because you want to label things as genocide, would school busing or desegregation be considered a form of genocide because those kids were taken out of their communities, either with bused to the white community?
It would apply under apartheid. Yes, it would apply under apartheid. So the definition that says deliberately cause or subjects the group to conditions of life that are intended to cause the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. The one word that summarizes that is apartheid. Apartheid in education, apartheid in housing, apartheid in finance, apartheid in food and water, apartheid in all these different areas, healthcare, for example. So the one you just mentioned would be apartheid in education. So definitely. And you can look at the effect of black teachers. There's only 2%, going back to benefits, 2% of black men are teachers. So again, black tax, right? Like these are not accidental if all of these numbers are forced to the same level, right?
You can also look at us, CPS.
Yep, CPS. We're 77% more likely to have our kids taken away. That's one of the highest statistics against us. And that would qualify under family separation, transfers by force children of the group to another group. And it's not that it's 77% because we're like bad parents. It's 77% because even if we have less risk of harming the kid, we're still 77% more likely. It has nothing to do with your risk factor. It has everything to do with our race and our status as freedmen. Black by popular demand. You got your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Chairman. Peace and reparations to the family. I love this topic. I think it's something that, it's kind of a different angle to approach reparations than the dead old rhetoric that many in the use. I wonder if, to my knowledge, the United Nations does not have the strength to compel a nation to address this issue because the Security Council nations have that veto, right? Permanent Security Council.
Well, there's five permanent members, right? And really, only they would have the power to force the U.S. But we have the power within the U.S. to make the U.S. do what it needs to do through voting and through our political power. We can't do it just by asking strangers of other countries. Like China has the power, but they are over there committing genocide against the Uyghurs. So it's like, both of them are pointing fingers at each other. The Chinese are pointing fingers at the U.S. and the U.S. is pointing fingers at China. But the only way things are really going to change, it's faster to change things internally than they are to change them externally, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I was just wondering because I know that the UN, in terms of any resolutions that it creates, any of the Security Council nations can veto. But in terms of the Hague, is the Hague involved in the discussion of reparations on the international level? And do they have the same limitations as the United Nations itself has?
Well, really, the only people that can enforce these things are people with military power. You can't enforce these things internationally without some type of leverage. China, Russia, two of the members on the Security Council that have veto power, they would be but I'm saying Russia and China would be the most likely in terms of the two of the five members.
The Hague is just the international court with
the ICC doesn't have a military though, so they can say shit, but they can't enforce things. You know what I mean? So what's gonna make the U.S. do it is either international pressure from one of the five members of the Security Council who has the military power to back up a demand. And then the only other way to do it is internally, which, like I said, is faster through our own political process because we have 32 million eligible freedmen voters. We could change everything in a single election. We just have to put in the organizing work. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the nuanced answer because I was kind of wondering about that. The other thing that I wanted to ask, obviously the dead-owed argument is, it's the popular one right now within the reparations community. I don't know ultimately how effective it will prove to be, but have you looked at the denial of equal protection under the law as an argument also, either in support of the genocide argument, to push pressure internally, or even as an alternate avenue?
Definitely. I mean that's a great insight, and it goes back to the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Those laws were specifically made for freedmen. You had, I know some people are against birthright citizenship right now because of the whole influx of immigration, but it was initially created for freedmen as a way to prevent the South from figuring out ways to stop us being citizens. They're like, you can't stop them if they're having babies in this country. That will automatically make them citizens. So now, we're kind of trying to figure out ways to solve that and make it specific again because it was initially intended for that purpose. Also, when you look at the 14th Amendment, all these people are talking about voting rights and needing to protect voting rights. There's two important things under Section 14, of the amendment, and it says Section 2 talks about basically voting rights, and like 2 and 3 are about voting, and basically one talks about what to do if voters, aka freedmen, have their vote suppressed, and how to handle the election in that case. And the other section talks about how to remove people that commit an insurrection and then want to run again. So all these people are trying to come up with things that were already created to keep Confederates out of office and to keep and enfranchise freedmen. And the 15th Amendment, is connected to this in terms of protecting those rights even more and equal protections and all these things in terms of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So they're the rules that we need to enforce the most, besides, things like the Second Amendment and freedom of speech and things like that. But those are the Reconstruction Acts made specifically for freedmen. The only other acts that were made specifically for freedmen during Reconstruction, and they actually came first, were the Freedmen's Bureau Act and the Freedmen's Bank Act. That came March 3rd, 1865. And Lincoln was killed for those two acts. The other acts wouldn't be passed until after Lincoln's assassination over Johnson's veto. America, you got your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, I was going to expound on the point about UN enforcement. The United Nations can't use military force to make any country carry out its
rulings. It mainly enforces its rulings through sanctions, which is like the peaceful, diplomatic way to get a country to do what you want. The only bad thing about that is when you have a international superpower like a China or United States, it's very hard to sanction us or China because our economies keep the entire world going. So if you put a sanction on us, it could literally cripple the entire world's economy and the entire economy could collapse. That's why even though China commits such atrocious human rights violations, they pump out, a vast majority of the world's exports, or they export a majority of the world's goods and services. So those sanctions won't do the entire world any good. So it's going to affect an innocent country that's not doing anything. And so, politically, you have to kind of maneuver that. And so that's why it's significantly harder to, like, when a major country is committing human rights violations, for them to be able to enforce it. I think it's horrible. I think that the United Nations should be a global governance body that actually globally governs instead of just sitting on the sideline and trying to have meetings and all that kind of stuff. I think the United Nations should step in when there's a dictator that's on the loose or whatever. But that's not how it works. There's a really good argument to make about the genocide. I hadn't thought about it that way. The only thing that I will say is, in the United States, the stats are kind of murky, only because we do live in a democracy, we live in a free nation, and some of these things, not all of these things, some of these things are by the free will of Black Americans. And so that's very hard to prove when you're talking about intent. When you bring up the CPS statistic, they're not going to present the 77% number. That number is going to go down because there are actual Black families that do commit CPS violations and they do get the children taken away.
But this is based on risk factor. So same risk factor, 77% more likely. So that's the point. That's why you got to break it down into actual more objective data points, right? And this is why the proof that we talked about earlier in terms of looking at the math. I'll just scroll through some of the data really quickly. This is the lynching and massacres, which encompasses killing members of the group. 4 times more likely to be killed. There's nothing. This is why looking at the data as a whole and as a percent of the population is important. There's nothing Black men are doing to get them killed at 4 times the rate of white men. You know what I mean? So it's like you can't argue, oh yeah, Black men just need to, talk nicer, or Black men need to stop wearing do-rags and hats and stop looking menacing. You know what I mean? Like, none of that is going to stop them getting killed at 4 times the rate. It's genocide by definition. So, you look at hate crime killings. We make up 54% of hate crime killings. There's nothing Black people are doing to make them more susceptible. It's kind of like what you kind of just said is kind of like the whole rape argument. Oh, you need to stop wearing skirts because you're more likely to be raped. And I'm kind of being facetious, you know what I mean? But I'm just saying, like, that's the type of argument people will make and be like, oh, you need to just be more nice and speak like this and do that, and then you won't be experiencing genocide. No, they're literally just look at the numbers and you can see statistically, it's not that we have to perform at some amazing way and have to be the best actors in the country to not be killed. Like, no, we're experiencing here. We're experiencing it here. We're experiencing it here. We're experiencing here. Like, wrongful convictions. The fact that we make up 50% of wrongful convictions means that they can arrest you for a crime, try you, throw your ass in jail, and then you have a 50% chance of getting out just because you're Black. That's crazy.
Right. I agree with you.
So we just gotta.
We're saying the same thing.
Yeah. I'm not arguing with. I'm not disagreeing with you.
I just don't want the notions to be made that I'm trying to say that Black people are responsible.
No. I was kind of joking. I was just like saying, like, people will use that type of argument and like go really run with it. Like white supremacists will run with that argument and basically say, like whenever there's a police killing, even Jalen Walker, they said, well, he shouldn't have did this and he shouldn't have did that. right? And so it's just like we gotta fight that type of narrative with data, and just show that it's just a ridiculous argument. Schools are more segregated now than they were in the civil rights movement. Like that's ridiculous. We are again around 10% of the population, but make up damn near 40% of the homeless, half the homeless people. Like the fact that you have a 50% chance of being homeless, like that's not an accident. Um, the abortion rate, the infant mortality rate, hysterectomy rate, maternal mortality rate. And like I said, when I even was going through the story of Fannie Lou Hamer and learned that when she was just getting a tumor removed, they performed a forced hysterectomy on her, it just goes to show you that like even people like our idols and people that we look up to have experienced this type of genocide. You know what I mean? Family separation. So these first three come from the California AB 3121 Reparations Task Force interim report. Uh, they talk about pensions and families, that's child welfare. They talk about child protective services. Similar situated black children were 77% more likely to be removed from their homes. You look at foster care, again, they're using all African Americans, but still 23% of the foster care, which means you're twice as likely to be in foster care. If you look at percent of population of missing persons, basically kidnappings of, and also of adults as well in terms of trafficking. But you look compared to the different races, Asian, more Asians, less kidnappings. Um, Black people, way more kidnappings in the population. White people, way bigger population, less kidnappings. Under 18 means that like most of the kidnappings are people under 18, basically kidnapped, right? Then you have some trafficking for people that are 18 plus, right? Point is, this should never happen. We shouldn't be around 13%, but represent damn near half of the people who are kidnapped. Like that's crazy. All of these things just go to show you. And now we have a mathematical way to prove it without needing to necessarily go back and forth with everybody in terms of, oh, I feel this way, I feel this way. Well, here's the data to back it up as well. I do want to start winding down. Um, if anybody else wants to come up to the stage, feel free to either send a request or grab the mic. I'm sending it out again. And then if anybody on stage has any last thoughts, we can start giving everyone a chance for any last thoughts.
Well, to quickly wrap up my point, because you said everything that I was trying to say, that there's going to be pushback, and those are the things that they're going to be looking into. In some of the statistics, they're going to be looking for the actual stats that show people wrongfully being moved from their homes, wrongfully being convicted of crimes, wrongfully doing all this kind of other stuff. So that's why I said some of the statistics can get murky, because some of the stats, they do factor in both people that have been wrongfully convicted and people that have been rightfully convicted. So that was only my point. But the stats that you gave were very accurate. They were very, very good. But I'm just saying that if we're going to prove genocide, you have to look at it from the wrongful, unjust side of it, so that and prove that it is significantly worse for the Black community than it is for any other community in the country. Because another thing they'll try to do is say, well, it's happening to everybody, or it's only happening 3 points or 15 points above Latinos or 2 points above Asians. So that was what I was just saying. For a full scope view of it, I'm a data analyst myself. I study political science, so I love this kind of stuff. And this is a very interesting topic, and I fully support it. If we're able to prove it, I'm 100% behind it, because we have to get a rightful, way to end this stuff for Black Americans one way or the other.
I totally agree. And if you're into data analysis and political science, that's exactly what this kind of breakdown is. You can check out the notes in the Jumbotron. Basically, like you were saying, like, oh, well, they'll say they're 2% of this and 2% of that. You could run the numbers for any race with this formula and prove that they're not experiencing genocide compared to us. You can prove that we are experiencing genocide, and then you can prove that they aren't. So let me go down. So this is the simple formula, right? You just find the percent of the population of the United States, that whatever race group you want to check if they're going through genocide, and then you just compare the cost or the benefit. And like the definition of genocide says, you only need to qualify for one of the definitions. So either the benefits or one of the costs. Um, and then that cost has to be greater than or equal to the percent of the population that you represent, or the benefit has to be less than the percent of the population you represent. In our case, we can run that number and say, again, 10, like 11% benefits, 2% genocide, or we could say 11%, and then the cost would be something like the exoneration rate of 50%, and you could say genocide. And then you can run the number for the white race and say they're 67% of the population, but is if we ran one benefit and said they receive 99% of venture capital funding, is 99 less than 67%? No, therefore not genocide, right? So we can literally run the numbers for any data that we want, whether it be a benefit or a cost, plug it in for any race, group, whatever, nationality, ethnic group, blah, 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 right? Like how it's defined by the UN, the United Nations and US, and then check it mathematically. And then like what we can even do, and when I get more time, I'll probably do this, turn this into an actual program where we could like even have people run different, plug in different numbers and spit it out and see if it's genocide or not. You know what I mean? But you could do plug and play and just, do it yourself. Um, so yeah. Anybody else wanted to add anything?
I think just to go ahead, one of the points in reference to genocide is the Freedmen community has on multiple levels experienced genocide in multiple topics, and you only have to qualify for one, and that lets you know the severity of where we are as a Freedmen community and why it is intentional. That's the importance of delineating our data, or the aggregation of our data, is because that's the reason they want to lump us all in reference to murders and crime, because now that we're delineating, we're finding out that a lot of the crimes that were committed were not even related to the Freedmen community. So although they want to try to say in reference to xenophobia, in reference to delineation, it is not. This was intentional to lump our data in, just like they're lumping their data in to make their population seem larger than it is. The same thing is in reference to making our population, watering down the severity of what's happening with the Freedmen community. But I just wanted to say that.
Definitely. And even in the venture capital case, that 1% is all blacks. And based on my observation, I would say only 20% of that 1% goes to freedmen. So we get 0.2%, and African immigrants get 0.8%. So it's really still lopsided. But still, that's still below the 2% black tax. So either way you slice it, we're getting screwed. CJ, did you have any last thoughts?
I just want to thank you for the space. This is good. Like I said, I'm not really a math person, but I'm gonna go back and go through it and start plugging in numbers, and I'll get it together. So I'll land on that. Peace and reparations to the room.
Yeah, bro, you got it. You got it. Yeah, just plug it in. Like all I do once I even when you want to test your program and test your math, you got to plug in numbers to make sure it works. So I wanted to make sure that I had my what do you call those things? Less thans going in the right directions and the right thans going, greater thans going in the right direction. So you definitely got to check your math, and then even when you do the program, you got to make sure you're doing kind of like before I had and means like you have to qualify for both. So like if I had right here two ands, it means B has to be less than X and X has to be less than or equal to C. Meaning that it would have to be both in order to qualify for genocide. Whereas the definition of genocide says or, right? So that's why you switch it to or and you say you only need to qualify for one, and then you can return true as it is genocide or false that it's not if you can't qualify for any of them, right? So.
Yo, I want to thank you for doing this too, man. You got a crazy ass for math, man. I wish I had wish I had your analytical skills like this.
Thank you, but I will say I hated math as a kid because my teachers were terrible and trash. But I went on this kind of like learning journey to try to prove to myself that I could, you know, learn things, and like learn things that people thought I couldn't learn. And the more I learned, the more confident I got, and the more comfortable I became with like math and things like that. And then when you go back to our history, whether it's building this country or building up Africa in the past, like we're always the inventors of virtually everything. And so um, we should also draw inspiration from our ancestors in that sense and realize that anything that they've achieved, we can achieve. Um, Anything that anyone else is capable of, we're all capable of. And you just got to put in the work to learn and study and practice and, one step at a time and you'll get there. All right. Well, that's a good note to end on. Thank you all for coming through. I know this was a little more technical, but the purpose again of sharing this was to show that we could prove this not just from our feelings, not just from um, pathos and ethos, but from logos, and make it airtight where, we could literally generalize it so anybody else could run the same test and prove it or not. So, boom, now we got it, and they can't say nothing to us. So, you can argue with them from passion, and then you can spit out the numbers and bring out the calculator and run it. So, there's a good quote actually to connect with this. This guy named John McCarthy, um, he had this quote. It's called "Shut up and calculate." And I kind of like it because whenever you want to just like prove something, just be like, all right, let me just get the numbers. Let me just run the numbers and check for myself. And so yeah, always just look up the numbers and a lot of this stuff. Like I had an intuition about the missing persons. I was like, we probably make up the greater percent of the population of than that are missing, right? And then I looked it up, and sure enough, that's exactly what came up, right? So, yep, always just look it up or ask a friend. Feel free to DM us if you have a question. DM any party members, uh, and yeah, just let us know if you have something you want us to learn or look up or research or questions you may have. But again, thank you all for coming. Y'all being patient. Y'all have a good day. Tomorrow we're having a great space with Cap. So please come out to that. Um, so that's going to be an exciting space. Whiteness of Wealth. Um, so yeah, check it out. 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 Eastern tomorrow. Y'all have a great rest of your day. Peace.
Peace and reparations.
Yep.